Gather around as we spill the tea on cybersecurity. We're talking about the topic in a way that everyone can understand. I'm your host, Jara Rowe, giving you just what you need. This is the Tea on Cybersecurity, a podcast from Trava. Welcome back to the Tea on Cybersecurity. We are kicking off the second half of the season by going back to the basics of cybersecurity. I hope the deep dive into the compliance process we went through in the first half was as helpful for all of you as it was for me. Now, we all know good hygiene is important, but did you know that hygiene matters in cybersecurity as well? We're going to learn about that very topic from my friends from Insight Assurance, Craig and Mario.
Thank you so much. My name is Craig Salah. I'm the Associate Director on the SOC 2 service line for Insight Assurance. I lead the APAC team and some of the Americas team. SOC 2 is my specialty in anything risk management, so excited to talk today.
Mario?
Wonderful. It's great to be here. My name is Mario, and I run the ISO team at Insight Assurance, and I actually brought my own tea to the tea on cybersecurity today.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. First question, Craig, I have for you. What is cyber hygiene?
The cyber hygiene is essentially the practice of maintaining good digital health. Just like we wash our hands and brush our teeth to stay physically healthy, cyber hygiene involves habits and really practices to keep our digital lives safe and secure. It encompasses everything from using strong passwords to updating software to just being generally suspicious of emails and websites. And I think additionally, I wanted to touch base on how cyber hygiene and GRC are related from an organizational perspective. As I mentioned, cyber hygiene involves everyday practices like you're updating software, keeping your strong passwords up to par. But GRC from an organizational perspective also focuses on a bigger picture that helps to drive cyber hygiene within an organization, specifically from that governance, risk, and compliance perspective.
All right, Mario, next question's for you. Why is it important for individuals and organizations alike when it comes to having a good cyber hygiene?
So it's actually the same for both. And I'm going to throw a little bit of auditor jargon here and say that cyber hygiene is basically just a series of habits that will help you or your organization maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information. And what that means for organizations is it can mean anything from avoiding reputational damage to avoiding potentially catastrophic financial loss stemming from leaks. And for individuals, it basically means protecting your confidential information and most importantly, your own identity, which as our life are becoming increasingly entangled with our online presence, it's much easier to steal somebody's identity nowadays if they gain access to some confidential data or information about that person. Cyber hygiene is absolutely key, whether you are an organization or an individual.
Craig, what role do employee training and awareness play in promoting cyber hygiene within organizations?
Employee training is really the frontline defense in any organization's cybersecurity strategy. Employees are your biggest asset, but sometimes also be your biggest threat. Human error is very prevalent. Educating staff about latest cybersecurity threats, teaching them to recognize phishing attempts, and instilling just best practices on from a day-to-day basis is going to significantly reduce the chances of cyber attacks. By fostering really a culture of cybersecurity from the top down, from the executive to C-suite level, it's really making active participants feel welcome in safeguarding the organization's assets and creating that formidable barrier against cybersecurity threats.
Mario, how often should individuals and organizations review and update their cyber hygiene practices to stay ahead of these threats?
This is going to vary wildly from organization to organization, but I'd feel comfortable saying that the consensus amongst information security professionals is that you should be reviewing your hygiene practices and your information security posture at least once per year. That's the advice usually given to organizations, but it's advice that I would also give individuals. I know that after I had my episode early in my career, that I review my information security posture and my cyber hygiene practices at least once per year. And now I do it with my wife. It's one of those items that we review at least once a year, like we would do our taxes or our finances, because it's really important to us and it's just really important to your identity nowadays as an individual. I would strongly advise at least to take a look once a year, even if you're an individual.
It's super helpful now because I always think of passwords. It's like the easiest thing. But when a software, something's like, you need to update your password. Super annoying on my behalf to come up with a new one, but it's important that we keep updating these things regularly for sure. Craig, are there any emerging trends or technologies in cybersecurity that can help enhance our cyber hygiene efforts?
There's a lot of new technologies. I think one of the biggest ones is artificial intelligence. For all my listeners, it is a double-edged sword. It does address risk, but it also introduces another risk as well. But I'll leave that for a different conversation. And as well as machine learning, it's making it easier to spot and stop cyber threats in real time. Log management and SIM tools make it you're having a watchdog in your organization. So hopefully you can identify suspicious activity and alert before any harm is done. I think third thing is finally advancements in cloud security and encryption. Every day, those are getting stronger and stronger. You see a lot of financial institutions continuously evolving these practices. Tools and technologies like this are just providing an extra layer of protection for our digital lives and just helping us stay safe.
Mario, I feel like we've been picking up on some tips and things to keep our cyber hygiene correct, but what are some practical tips or resources you can recommend our listeners who want to improve their cyber hygiene habits?
On my own experience and seeing how hundreds of cases of breaches and identity theft have carried out, what I would advise first is to always secure your means of verification first. So those are the big bastions that companies with whom you have accounts use to verify your identity, meaning your main email, your phone number, your biometrics, anything that's being used to verify that you are in fact you needs to be fully secured. And if that implies having multi-factor authentication implemented, having any other sort of additional verification or layer implemented in your process, having biometrics verification, that's going to be absolutely crucial to protecting the core accounts that you're going to use to verify that it is in fact you in case anybody wants to steal your identity. The next one also goes hand in hand with the first one. It's make sure that you set up a strong PIN with your phone carrier, because that's also one of the means of verification that people often forget about. Clear your open device sessions at least once per year, but if possible, do it more frequently, because sometimes we log into computers that are not ours, or maybe somebody somehow got to open a session on a device that's not ours in a far off place of the world. And clearing those open sessions is going to help mitigate the amount of time that they have access to your information and to your data. Next one is also fairly self-explanatory, and Craig's already touched on this, but ensuring you're not installing applications from shady websites or untrusted sources, especially if you're going to be giving them your personal data or any data that they could use to engineer or reverse engineer your passwords or any confidential information. And lastly, and this is important, this is not a preventative measure, but it's important as well, make sure that you monitor your identity by using any sort of identity monitoring tool that's trustworthy. I know the big credit bureaus offer that functionality. There's standalone applications and services that offer it as well. And also that you're monitoring your data in the dark web. And of course, the big one, which is make sure that your passwords are complex and that you are updating them whenever you realize using those password monitoring tools and those identity monitoring tools that it could have potentially been breached or compromised. Those are the big tips I would give our listeners.
All right, Craig. So looking ahead, how do you envision the future of cyber hygiene evolving, and what challenges or opportunities do you anticipate?
Really, in the future, staying safe online is likely going to become more and more critical as technology evolves. Every day we see the digital age changing and us becoming more and more ingrained in that. But we also see simpler ways to protect ourselves. Like I mentioned, AI, hopefully better automated tools that can help us block threats without us having to do much. In a perfect world, of course. But there's also going to be new challenges, such as hackers getting more creative with their attacks, or new types of devices becoming a vector for these cyber criminals and cyber crime. It's going to be it's going to be very, how do we as information security professionals stay one step ahead of these criminals to essentially safeguard ourselves, safeguard our assets, etc.
So, Mario, how can early SaaS companies or founders with limited resources, because I know that's a big thing when it comes to cybersecurity, prioritize their cyber hygiene efforts effectively?
I'm just going to give you the most important one, in my opinion, which is education is by far the most cost-effective tool that you can deploy in your organization before any other type of information security controls or complex tools or any additional services. Using the hygiene analogy, you can buy the most expensive toothbrush and you can buy the fanciest toothpaste, but if you don't teach your child that they need to brush their teeth every night, they're still going to get cavities. It's absolutely important that those habits are instilled from an organizational perspective as early and as embedded as possible.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely hope that those founders listen to this episode and pick up on all of these little tidbits that you guys have been giving me throughout. Those will make a world of difference for not only the company, but the individuals as well. Craig, in the event of a security incident or breach, what steps should organizations take to assess the impact and recover effectively if something were to happen?
So the way I like to think about it, I like to use the 4 NIST steps. Those are preparation, as step 1, detection analysis, step 2. Step 3 is containment, eradication, and recovery. And then step 4 is really that post-incident activity. So preparation, do you have the appropriate resources in place? Do you have the appropriate policies and procedures in place? Do you have the appropriate playbooks in place to recover from an incident or to showcase to your organization what to do in an incident? Then the detection and analysis stage. Do you have the proper tools in place? Are your resources trained to use those tools and identify those anomalies? In my opinion, I think detection is one of the most important areas because you cannot address what you cannot detect. Step 3 is really about that containment, eradication, and recovery phase. It's about stopping this attack from spreading, hopefully eliminating the root cause and really getting operations back to normal as quickly as possible. Think about if a computer is infected with malware, you want to be able to remove that from the network as soon as possible so it doesn't infiltrate the rest of the network. And the last stage is post-incident activity. Doing a lessons learned document of what went right, what went wrong, what we can do in the future, and what do we need to update? Do we need to update policies, procedures? Do we need to potentially get more resources for our organization? And how can we really prevent this specific cyber attack from happening again? We can't prevent all of them, but at least if we learned anything, how do we prevent this?
All right, Mario, I know this is your guys' bread and butter here. How does compliance with regulatory standards and frameworks contribute to improving cyber hygiene practices?
Of course, risk management and continual improvement are at the heart of pretty much every single regulatory standard and framework for information security. Thankfully, you've already educated your listeners on a little bit of 27001, so I can go back to that jargon. The plan, do, check, and act model that is at the heart of the ISO standard is very applicable to other frameworks as well and to most organizations. So essentially, in my particular example, and I'll contextualize it in what happened to me, the first step is you plan. You basically sit down and think on what you're going to do and how you're going to address your risks. In my particular case, I knew I had sensitive accounts, so I knew I had to have complex passwords. That's a plan component. Then you do, meaning I actually implemented the complex passwords, and then you check your work and whether it was effective or not. In this case, sometimes you don't check yourself, sometimes life checks you. And in this particular case, check me saying, hey, the passwords you thought were complex, not complex enough. They had a common structure and they could be guessed. And so you then go to the act phase, which is, okay, now that I know whether my measures were effective or not, now I have to take action on it and start the cycle again with another plan, do, check, and act cycle to see. And that's what you continually do. Basically, perfect information security is a myth. You're never going to have perfect security. But following that model that most information security frameworks, including 27001, outline for you, you're going to be able to get as close as possible, assuming that you follow those steps and keep continually improving your information security posture. In my particular case, the act was, okay, I'm just going to have more complex passwords that don't share any common structure. And up to this point, it seems to have worked. You still got to follow the process to make sure you're continually improving. That's what information security frameworks and regulations do for you.
What advice would you give to our listeners to empower them to take these proactive steps in improving their cyber hygiene practices?
Taking control of your digital security really begins with adopting that proactive mindset and implementing just down cyber hygiene practices in your daily life. One is start by conducting a thorough audit of your digital footprint. Identify areas where security measures can be enhanced. I think Mario touched on a lot of this in day-to-day lives. Invest in a reputable password manager to generate and store complex passwords for your accounts. The next is definitely enabling MFA where possible, so it just adds that extra layer of security. And then staying informed about the latest cybersecurity threats. There's so many blogs out there and there's so many news articles. I mean, you can do a quick search of cybersecurity threats and we could find hundreds of articles and just take a quick read of that. It may take 5 minutes, but maybe you'll learn something that you haven't and you can incorporate that in your daily life. And then specifically from the organizational perspective, I think really starting with potentially outside help to help conduct assessments like SOC 2, it can pave the way for better cyber hygiene and GRC practices going forward.
Just be mindful. It's not ideal, but you need to be suspicious most of the time. That's a mindset that's going to allow you to at least verify whether something is legitimate or not. It's unfortunate that we have to be suspicious in our daily lives, but there's no amount of information security controls that's going to save you if you're not paying attention. So I would say that's the most important part. Always have your 15%, 20% level of suspicion activated just to be able to pick out those criminals that are getting better by the day and make sure that you're protecting yourself.
All right, Mario and Craig both, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Now that we've spilled the tea on cyber hygiene, it's time to go over the receipts. I learned so much from Craig and Mario's insights about cyber hygiene and even some of the compliance things. So I have a couple things I would really like to go over. First is, what is cyber hygiene? And it's really just a series of good habits when it comes to cybersecurity practices. It's good digital health. They also talked to me about poor hygiene and what that can do for us. So it invites a host of threats, including malware, data breaches, and unfortunately, identity theft. So for those reasons alone, we definitely want to make sure we're doing our part to make sure that our cyber hygiene is up to par. One of the other receipts that I took away throughout this entire episode was the importance of training and education. They both mentioned several times that employees are often weak links, which we've talked about that previously. So it's important that they understand why two factor authentication is important, why you should have different passwords on different websites and things of that sort. So the importance of awareness training is also a cheap way for early stage companies to implement, to just make sure that not only their company is safe, but their employees and then their customer data is safe as well. And if you want to learn a little more about cybersecurity awareness training in general, we had an entire episode in the second season titled Cybersecurity Awareness Training is Not an Option, It's Essential. And I highly recommend that you go back and listen to that. Now back to cyber hygiene. One of the other things I took away is to make sure we have a good cyber hygiene. Something that we hear a lot during the tea on cybersecurity is, you guessed it, the importance of MFA and 2FA. So if you don't have those simple things implemented on your accounts, make sure you do. Mario even talked about like biometrics and things like that. Like, you definitely want to make sure that you're using things that are unique to you to make sure that your accounts are safe. And one of the final receipts I have from this episode are just good habits to have when it comes to cybersecurity and our personal cyber hygiene. So we want to make sure that our verification fits, like I was just talking about with biometrics, that it's like unique to you. We definitely want to make sure that we have strong pins on our phones. We don't want anybody to be able to crack those. And it's also super important to make sure that we clear open sessions across devices. Like, for instance, if you were to use a friend's computer to log in somewhere, or you used an iPad somewhere and you logged in, you want to definitely go through those particular accounts and make sure you close the sessions across devices to make sure only you have access to your accounts. We also want to make sure that we monitor our identity. Mario gave a great example of why that's important. It's something that happened to him. And the last thing with good habits is simply just to have a proactive mindset. We've also talked about that a lot on the T on cybersecurity, and why it's important to be proactive when it comes to like our cybersecurity and, of course, our cyber hygiene. And that's the tea on cybersecurity. If you like what you listen to, please leave a review. If you need anything else from me, head on over to Trava Security. Follow wherever you get your podcasts.